Sure that icon pops up. There we go. All right, I think we're ready to roll. So good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Sam Furio. I'm the outreach coordinator for MDE's Building Decarbonization team. I will be moderating this afternoon session, the Exemption Process Working Group Session 1. For those of you that have emailed the Building Decarbonization team, I am the face behind the email and also the face behind the phone if you've given us a call. So thank you for joining this first session of this Exemption Process Working Group. Today, Dr. Zach Brazola, affectionately known as Dr. Decarb, will be reviewing the exemption forms and explaining supporting information that must be provided for an exemption request for the proposed BEPS. So before we get started, if you joined our informational sessions before, you know, sometimes we roll with a pretty deep bench of presenters, but today you are stuck with MDE's Building Decarbonization team, and it's just us here today delivering content. So with that, I think it's appropriate to introduce the rest of the team. And so I'd like to introduce Chris Menser, the Building Decarbonization Technical Specialist. So Chris, if you want to come off camera, say hey.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, Chris. And then also Zach, Dr. Decarb, who, like I said, will also be presenting today.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, and thank you all for joining us. Really getting ready to go through this and the great work Chris and Sam have been doing, and as we're working to roll this all out. So excited to hear your feedback and share this all with you today. Take it away, Sam.
Alrighty, sounds good. So if you joined our sessions before, you know there's always a spiel I got to give right at the beginning. So bear with me. And so just so you know, this session will be recorded and uploaded to the Maryland Department of the Environment's BEPS YouTube playlist. We will share a link to the slides in the description of the video after it is posted to our YouTube playlist. So just so you know, got a caller, got to admit them. The chat has been disabled for this session. In order to submit questions for the Q&A portion of this session, you'll need to click on the Activities button, which is found in the bottom right corner of the screen. It shows a circle, triangle, square. The Q&A feature is accessible via this button. We will also be doing a poll feature during this session at the beginning. You can access the poll feature with this Activities button as well. So circle, triangle, square if you want to ask a question during this session, or if you want to participate in the poll. So Dr. Decarb is going to jump in probably halfway or a little earlier than halfway through today, but I can't let him hog the whole spotlight for today's session. So before handing it over to him, I'm going to go through a couple things first. I'm going to provide a brief overview of BEPS today, but before diving in, if you require more in-depth details of BEPS than what I highlight today, we would point you to previous webinars and technical documentation that is currently available for viewing on the department's BEPS website. You can access the website by scanning the QR code on the left side of the screen or by searching Maryland BEPS in Google. Additionally, if you would like to be added to our BEPS email list, you can do so by scanning the QR code on the right side of the screen. Today's webinar is focused on a specific aspect of BEPS implementation, but if you have any questions regarding the proposed regulation, you may contact the Building Decarbonization team via the email address or phone number at the bottom of your screen. And so just a working group or a purpose of this exemption process working group, we are going to, throughout these working group sessions, review exemption forms and explain supporting information that must be provided for an exemption request. We're going to solicit feedback from you all, our attendees, on the available forms and the application processes. And then we're also going to host and have some time for Q&A during these sessions. And so an agenda for this session, session 1, we're going to do an intro to BEPS. We're going to do what's a BEPS exemption, go over that. We're going to talk about BEPS benchmarking and performance standards. We're going to review available exemption forms. We're going to release a form or a survey for feedback on the available exemption applications, and then also, as time allows, have a chance for some Q&A at the end of the session. And just before we dive into that BEPS overview, we have a poll question for you all that we'd love for you to participate in. If you're just joining now, you can get to the poll feature via the circle, triangle, square button in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. It's labeled Activities. You click on Polls, and you can tell us which options work for you for the question, what type of building exemption are you interested in applying for? And those options being a historic building or space, a public or non-public elementary or secondary school, a manufacturing building, an agricultural building, a building owned by the federal government, or you're not interested in applying for an exemption, you're just here to learn about the process. So we'll give that a minute, see what kind of responses are funneling in for us. All right. 40 votes in so far. That's pretty good. Over half of our attendees. So we'll give this another few seconds. Circle, triangle, square, activities button. Click there if you want to participate in the poll on what type of building exemption are you interested in applying for. All right, and with that, I think we can show everyone the results and end the poll. And so 43 votes in. A couple of folks are interested in historic and school and manufacturing exemptions. We got one for agricultural, but a lot of folks are interested in just learning about the process, and they're not looking at those specific property type exemptions. So that's great. Thank you all for joining. Great to see those responses. And I'll just plug again, if you have a question for today's Q&A portion, you can get to that Q&A Q&A feature via the circle, triangle, and square button as well. It's just under polls, so submit your questions there. All right. And so with that, we'll move into an overview of the BEPS regulation. And so we saw a lot of new names register for today's session. So we're going to give a brief overview of the regulation and types of covered buildings to level set for everyone's benefit. For those of you who have seen this all many times before, thank you for your patience. But just want to provide an overview of the proposed BEPS. So the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022 required the Maryland Department of the Environment to implement building energy performance standards for large buildings in the state. And these building energy performance standards aim to reduce emissions from large buildings to assist in meeting the state's GHG reduction goals of 60% by 2031 and net zero by 2045. BEPS also aims to reduce energy costs for building owners and also improve indoor and outdoor air quality for Marylanders. So just a overview of what does BEPS apply to and what requirements do owners of these buildings need to meet. So most buildings greater than 35,000 square feet or larger are considered covered buildings. These covered buildings must annually report energy consumption beginning next year. These first reports are due June 1st, 2025. So that is about 6 months from now. So building owners will need to annually report their energy consumption to the department. And then in 2030, 5 years down the road, building owners will need to start meeting phased emission standards. And also in 2030, building owners can choose to make an alternative compliance payment for a building's excess emissions over the standard. And so moving into the covered building stock in Maryland. So again, I said these are buildings greater than 35,000 square feet, excluding any parking garage area. So based on a preliminary analysis, underlying the BEPS regulation. There are over 9,000 buildings, covered buildings in the state of Maryland. And on this screen, you can see the distribution of property types within this count of 9,000 buildings. So you can see that the majority of covered buildings in the state are warehouse spaces, office spaces, multifamily housing, and retail stores. And here, using that same analysis, we can see where these covered buildings are located throughout Maryland. So you can see that every county in the state has covered buildings greater than 35,000 square feet, but the majority of them are located between Baltimore and DC along the I-95 corridor. So what does an owner of one of these covered buildings need to do? So first and foremost, determine if they are covered or if they fall into one of the total exemption buckets that we will discuss today. If you fall into one of these total exemption buckets, well, you joined the right informational session, because Dr. Decarb will talk next steps for you all when he takes over here shortly. Now, if a building owner is covered, they will need to start annually reporting their building's energy consumption data to MDE with using Energy Star Portfolio Manager. This is the department's chosen benchmarking tool. The first reporting deadline for building owners is June 1st, 2025, with reporting their calendar year 2024 energy use data. Then, once they start benchmarking, building owners will be able to see the performance of their buildings compared to the proposed standards for their property types. They can then determine if changes are needed to achieve the standards. 5 years down the road, starting in 2030, building owners will need to annually achieve the proposed standards for their property type, or achieve partial compliance and make an alternative compliance payment for their excess emissions. So let's dive a little deeper into the performance standards portion of building energy performance standards. As I just mentioned, these standards will come into effect in 2030, and they will take the form of a phased reduction of on-site direct emissions by the type of building. The standard is concerned with combustion on-site. The phased reduction guides building owners to the final standard of net zero direct emissions in 2040 and beyond. So in 2030 to 2034, building owners will need to achieve interim standard 1 level of emissions, which is their highest emissions allotment for this phased reduction. Then the standards will tighten, and building owners will need to achieve interim standard 2 levels from 2035 and to 2039. And as I mentioned, all buildings, regardless of property type, need to meet net zero direct emissions in 2040 and beyond. So additionally, the department intends to adopt an energy efficiency standard called Site Energy Use Intensity, or EUI, in 2027, and recommends not installing inefficient electric equipment as you are planning improvements to your building. So we like to say that building owners have a long runway for BEPS compliance. The initial 5 years of BEPS compliance is solely energy data reporting. There are no performance standards during this period. Then, starting in 2030, the standards come into effect, but we model that 1/3 of Maryland's covered building stock is already meeting that final standard of net zero. So it's possible that when you start benchmarking, you find out that your building already meets the final standard, or maybe one of those interim standards I mentioned. And so your runway to compliance lengthens. And so, along this runway, there's considerable time. And if you're just hearing about BEPS, you're not behind the times at all. MDE and other state agencies are here to help you throughout this process. And so with that, that's a brief overview of BEPS. And if you require more in-depth details, I'd refer you to the BEPS website or a BEPS YouTube playlist where we post all of our recorded informational sessions. But with that, I will now turn things over to Zach or Dr. Decarb to talk about the exemption process and relevant applications. Zach, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam, and welcome again, everybody. So let's talk about BEPS exemptions. A building owner may apply for their building to be exempt from complying with the benchmarking and building energy performance standards for multiple reasons. And so if we go to the next slide, you're going to be applying for an exemption. and the building owner is going to have to submit that exemption request form to the department along with supporting documentation. We're going to thoroughly evaluate each exemption request, and resubmissions for exemption status may be required by the department at the department's discretion. And the applications for various exemption forms will be listed on the department's website after the regulations are finalized. So all that's to say, more to come, but what our goal here today is to give you a view of the drafts of all of these different exemption forms, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But give you drafts, allow some opportunity for feedback, both in the Q&A and longer term. We have a feedback form we're going to share with you at the end, where you can go and look back on all of these and review them, provide that feedback, and we're going to be reviewing all that feedback as we move forward. So let's go to the next slide. We've made this really nice infographic to help you understand the different exemptions that are in the proposed BEPS regulation. There are some what we're calling total exemptions. You apply once. Again, the department could ask that you reapply in future, but for the most part, these are, apply once and you're out unless otherwise notified. And so those are these designated historic buildings, agricultural buildings, elementary and secondary school buildings, in general referred to as K through 12 schools, federally owned buildings, manufacturing buildings, and demolished buildings. So if your building's been demolished as well, that kind of falls into that category. There are also total exemptions that are for annual purposes. If your building's in financial distress or completely unoccupied, you can apply annually to be exempted from complying with the BEPS regulation in sum for that year. And you can keep applying to those for as long as it applies to your building. You can also apply for a baseline exemption. Basically, if your building is low occupancy, under 50%, you can apply to push out the baseline year for your building a few years for that occupancy to go up. You can apply annually a maximum of 3 times. Finally, there is the alternative compliance payment adjustment, which is an annual application for affordable housing providers to apply for reduced alternative compliance payments. And there's some requirements there around actually working towards projects in the long run that are going to reduce their emissions. We have a whole working group discussing this, so we'll talk about it a little bit today. But if you've got more questions, just how you sign up for this session in our informational session sign up form, there is that a space for that affordable housing working group, and that's really the place where I'm going to direct any questions about that. I'm just going to tell you, if you ask us, to come to that session because we go really deep in the weeds there. Let's go to the next slide. There are also some annual energy exclusions, and most of these, we get questions every time about these. These are in the proposed regulation. Most of these we've discussed already in our benchmarking and reporting working group. You can go to our YouTube page and find the slides and the recordings of this working group. And so if you've got questions about any of these and you ask them today, I'm just going to tell you to go back and look. The only one, but in general, these annual energy exclusions for food service facilities, EV charging, outdoor heated pools, and parking lots, those 4, they don't need applications. You just do it as part of your benchmarking, and that's in the technical manual and guidance. So for those 4, it's just a matter of how you enter it in, and we've got drafts released and now are editing based on feedback we received from you all to streamline how that process works. The real thing we're putting this up here for, though, is required combustion generators. We'll get into that a little bit more in the definitions page, but that one actually does require applications for exempting the emissions from those required combustion equipment, and mainly generators. So let's talk about some definitions. Historic buildings, or a space within a building. It must be individually designated as a historic property under federal, state, or local law, separate and apart from a building's inclusion in a historic district. And actually, let me take a pause here for a moment before I dive in. All of these that I'm reading you today are coming directly out of the proposed regulation. You can see that in the Maryland Register, September 6th, if you want to, but you can also get there via link from our BEPS webpage. So these are all out of that proposal. And I'm just going to read through all of these so that we're all on the same page as we get into what the actual applications look like. So I read to you historic, public or non-public elementary or secondary school buildings. It's exactly what it sounds like. A manufacturing building is a building involved in the process of substantially transforming or a substantial step in the process of substantially transforming tangible personal property into a new and different article of tangible personal property by the use of labor or machinery or otherwise designated as manufacturing building by the department. Agricultural buildings, a structure that is used primarily to cultivate, manufacture, process, or produce agricultural crops, raw materials, products, livestock, or commodities, including a greenhouse. Next, the building owned by the federal government. It has to actually be owned by the federal government. A financial distress. This has three different options. The property is subject of a tax lien sale or public auction due to property tax arrearages. The property has to be controlled, or the property is controlled by a court-appointed receiver, or the property was acquired by a deed in lieu of foreclosure in the last calendar year. Finally, unoccupied, a building not occupied for the entirety of the calendar year being reported. And then actually, truly finally, affordable housing providers, the owners of a covered building that primarily provides housing to limited income households where a minimum of 51% of households living within the building are at or below 80% of the area median income as defined in the Housing and Community Development article, section 4-1801 in the Annotated Code of Maryland, or a covered building that is restricted under the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, LIHTC program. So there's two different ways. We get asked about this one a lot too. You can be in LIHTC. You can also meet the definition here of 51% of households. You don't necessarily have to be a designated affordable housing. You could be naturally occurring affordable housing that meets this definition. So this one is a little bit broader. We actually have, again, for this one, a whole separate working group. So if you're going to ask, if you ask questions about that, about affordable housing today, there's opportunities for feedback, but we're mostly going to ask you to come to our affordable housing working group where we really, again, dive into the nitty-gritty details of this section. So now that we've got those definitions out of the way, let's talk about the actual information that's needed to apply for these exemptions. As we mentioned before, we're sharing this all now, and we'll provide a feedback form at the end. If you have general questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A, but if you've got some more specific ones about the actual, what's on the slides, please send it via the feedback form. We're definitely not going to have time today to get into details. If you've got minute questions or suggestions, that's exactly what the feedback forms are, and we look forward to seeing that all from you. So let's dive in. This is pretty standard. We're putting this up here. Again, this is going to be the main thing asked for on every form across all the different ones that we have as you apply, the contact information and the building owner information, because we know these are often submitted maybe by a third-party firm or something like that. But we also want to make sure that we're capturing, as you apply, the actual building owner. So let's keep moving. A historic exemption form. A building owner must provide documentation showing that the covered building meets the exemption criteria as specified in the BEPS regulation that we've proposed. And by submitting that form, you're certifying the building meets the definition of a historic building. That is, a historic building or space within a building must be individually designated as a historic property under federal, state, or local law, separate and apart from a building's inclusion in a historic district. I read that already, just again, hitting that home. And we're asking, is that building listed on the potentially covered buildings list? If so, you're going to provide a unique identifier that is going to be on that list. And if it's determined exempt, we're going to be removing it. If it's not there, but it's still over 35,000 square feet, and this is something we get asked a lot, then you're going to be, if you're still meet the definition of a covered building, but you're not on that potentially covered buildings list, you're still covered unless you're exempt. But then here, this is that opportunity to apply if you're not listed, but you would otherwise be covered. And then provide a detailed description of what qualifies this as a historic property, namely, which federal, state, or local law that puts you in that category. And then please provide an attachment providing this evidence. This could include a copy of the building's listing on the National Register of Historic Places, a proclamation or law from your local city or county government, or a listing by the Maryland Historical Trust. Let's keep moving. Schools. Again, this is a public or non-public primary or secondary school building, non-public elementary or secondary school building, excuse me. Again, if it's listed on the covered buildings list, please provide the unique building identifier. If not, you can provide the floor area. And the key question, and we get this a lot, is this building used as an elementary or secondary school instructional building? Is this an actual school building teaching people in elementary or secondary school? That's generally the key criteria here. I will note for schools, we've been working with the Department of Education so that we're going to do our best to take all the school buildings off in the first place because that is a known list of the permitted schools, but there are always outliers, so this does exist for that reason. And allows anyone that is not sure, they don't see their name on the list, their school on the big list that we will also publish, which will have here's our list of schools, and where we get it from the Department of Education, they can still apply. So this one mostly, for most people, will be a formality because we're doing our best to handle that ahead of time. Let's keep moving. Excuse me. A manufacturing exemption. A building owner is going to have to provide the documentation to meet that definition we talked about before. And just like all these major exemptions, if they're listed on the potentially covered buildings list, you can provide your unique ID. And if it's determined exempt, we'll pull you off. If you're not listed, but you would still otherwise meet the definition of a covered building, you've got to apply, put this information in, and provide a little bit about the building, the manufacturing activities going on in that building. Is this truly meeting that all to show that it is truly meeting that definition of what a manufacturing building is. And you can provide an attachment evidence that the building is being used for manufacturing. So that's manufacturing. Let's keep moving. Agricultural building, as the definition we talked about before, used primarily to cultivate, manufacture, process, or produce agricultural crops, raw materials, products, livestock, or commodities, including a greenhouse. Is it on the list or not? Description of the use of that property and any attachments to prove that. Let's move to the next one. A building that is owned by the federal government. Is it on the list or not? Please provide the unique ID. And if not, provide some additional information just to help us understand where it fits in everything. And then that detailed description and any attachment showing that it is owned actually by the federal government. Let's go to the next one. As you'll see, basically all of these were very similar. The slight requirements vary based on the wording in the proposed regulation. And so that's kind of where they are. But as we get to the feedback form at the end, there'll be space to comment on each one of these individually. As we saw, folks here are coming from lots of different backgrounds and different buildings they might be applying for exemption for. So feel free to just comment on the one that's relevant to you and leave the rest blank. That's totally fine. And we'll want to hear a little bit about, when you're thinking about filling this out, is there anything you have questions or concerns about? So we've been hearing from you all and some folks hearing a lot from you all in the last couple of months. And so some folks have noted that buildings that are listed on our preliminary potentially covered buildings list currently available on the BEPS website, that there are a few buildings on there under 35,000 square foot threshold and thus not a covered building. So that list, again, it's preliminary and it's our potentially covered buildings list because it's our best effort based on publicly available data to identify all those buildings that meet the definition of covered buildings in the state. But we know there are some buildings over 35,000 square feet that are not on that list. And we know that in a few instances, as folks have pointed out, we might have gotten it wrong and included someone on that potentially covered buildings list that is not included. And so this form is basically for those handful of buildings to be able to have that pathway to say, hey, I'm 34,500 square feet. I'm not covered. And somehow the tax assessor had said that I'm 35,000. So that's what this form is for. And we'll be working continuously to improve that list and take this information from the forms to make updates to the potentially covered buildings list. So, if this is you can use this form, and if your application is approved, you'll be removed from the list. Most folks are not going to need to use this form. We've done a pretty good job, and the state's tax data is pretty good. But again, we know of, probably can count on one hand right now that we know of buildings that might be off. And so this does exist for this reason. So buildings seeking exemption must prove they do not meet the definition of a covered building. That is, and we've actually, I don't think we put this up because we've been talking about what's not a covered building. So I'll just restate it here. A covered building is a building that is a commercial or multifamily residential building in the state of Maryland or is owned by the state of Maryland and has a gross floor area of 35,000 square feet or more, excluding the parking garage area, and is a single building. One or more buildings held in the condominium form of ownership with a combined gross floor area of 35,000 square feet or more, excluding the parking garage area, and covered by a single board of managers. Or two or more buildings with a combined gross floor area of 35,000 square feet or more, excluding the parking garage area, that are served in a whole or in part by the same electric or gas meter, or are served by the same heating or cooling system or systems, which is not a district energy system. So, and then in the actual proposed regulation, there's one more clause here which says, unless you meet these exemption things, which is mainly what we're talking about today. But if you're not one of these, if you don't meet this requirement and you're under 35,000 square feet, this is what the form's for. So you're going to provide the unique ID because you've been listed. This form is only for those buildings listed on the list that need to get pulled off. And then you would provide some information as to why you are not covered. Let's move on. Demolished, yeah. I think this one speaks for itself. If your building's been demolished, you're not a covered building. I will note, if you rebuild a building on that same property and it is over meets the definition of that covered building, 35,000 square feet or over, or one of the funky other subcategories, you do need to comply once that building is occupied. And there's some more information on new construction and that timeline. Basically, it takes a year, but that timeline is in the proposed regulation. But in the interim, if you actually demolish the building and it's razed to the ground, you can apply for exemption. Provide some information about the date it was demolished and anything else that shows that it was actually demolished. So let's keep moving. Financial distress. We talked about this a lot before, but this is, you can apply for the building to be exempt from complying with benchmarking and performance standards when the building owner can provide documentation showing that the property is under financial distress. One of those three options that's kind of in the middle of the screen we talked about before. This can be extended each year through reapplication if the building still meets that criteria. If a building was in financial distress and was sold or changed ownership and these kind of go away, it no longer qualifies for that exemption. So you have to check off one of these ones to do it. And you can request this exemption at any point before the reporting deadline of June 1st of each year for the previous calendar years of reporting. You can't request this after the reporting deadline. Keep it here. And please provide some documentation of this. On to affordable housing. An affordable housing provider may apply for reduced alternative compliance fees for 1 calendar year if they can provide documentation that shows an application to a federal or Maryland administered program that would reduce the building's greenhouse gas emissions. I already read the affordable housing provider definition, so I'm not going to read it again, but that's the kind of key thing here. Please note applications for those reduced alternative compliant payments must be submitted before June 1st of each year, beginning in 2031. This is all about alternative compliance payments, which don't take effect until the proposed standards would take effect in 2030, with reporting and compliance happening by June 1st, 2031. So this form, it does exist now, or the application will exist, but it doesn't have to really come into play until a little later. Any exemption that is approved by the department is limited to that year. It does not extend to past or future years. However, if you have an ongoing uncompleted project, you can reapply and keep it going if it's going to take multiple years. You just have to prove that you're actually still working towards it. Let's keep going to the next slide. So that's all this one's a little wordy. What did you have to do, and what are we asking for? Well, you're a covered building, so you have a unique ID. Talk about the federal program that you're applying to, when you anticipate the project to begin and finish, knowing that many of these might take more than a year. You are required as part of this to keep reporting your energy use data to MDE under the reporting requirements of BEPS. So you just have to state that you do this, and then you have to provide some documentation that you're qualify as affordable housing, that you've applied to that program, and some information about what you're trying to do and the associated estimated emissions reductions. So let's keep moving. Unoccupied. A building owner may apply for an exemption from the benchmarking performance standard requirements of the regulation for 1 calendar year when the building owner can provide documentation showing that the covered building was not occupied for the entirety of the calendar year being reported. You can resubmit this annually. A good example for this is if you construct a new building, it's standing, but people haven't moved in yet at all, then this would be a reason you might apply for unoccupied. Or you are preparing for demolition and the building's been emptied out, no one's in there, but you're maybe doing some work in it to remediate something before you demolish it, and it's a full year. This would be a way to apply. And you can resubmit this annually. Or if you just have a vacant building, that's another case. You could apply for exemption here. Partially unoccupied buildings, or if you have temporary vacancies, you don't qualify for this particular one. If your building was less than 50% occupied for at least 180 days, then you can submit this next form, which is about less than 50% occupancy. You can apply for 1 calendar year at a time when you can provide documentation showing that less than 50% of the floor area of the covered building was occupied for at least 180 days of the year. And you can do this to basically push off establishing your baseline performance, but you can only do this for 3 years. You must still provide emissions and energy use reporting to the department, but it doesn't establish the baseline, and completely unoccupied buildings do the previous one. So let's keep moving. And then the next one, we get this question a lot, and I mentioned this at the beginning. There is an exemption for energy use for required combustion equipment. The building owner, in the proposed regulation, it states the building owner shall exclude from the benchmarking report sub-metered and separately metered energy consumption data for emissions from required combustion equipment under the following conditions. If a federal or state regulation requires that covered building, including a healthcare facility, laboratory, assisted living and nursing facility, military building, critical infrastructure, and building used in life sciences, to use a backup generator or other equipment that shall run on combustible fuels. Note that your covered building is required to include emissions from a combustion generator or other equipment if that relevant federal or state regulation is updated to allow battery storage and or other types of systems that do not produce direct emissions. So basically for this one, your covered building, give the unique ID and describe why that building meets the above requirements. And if you go to the next slide, just some other basic information about how you're going to exclude it. And we'll have a little bit of information in a table to submit the actual annual fuel consumption, because that will need to be tracked if it's not getting excluded otherwise. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and this is what that table looks like. What's the equipment being used, the make, the model, the output, the fuel type, the total fuel usage, and the number of hours per year, so that we can make sure we're tracking that emissions and pulling those out of your benchmarking reports as required. And as well, the documentation showing a federal or state regulation that requires the covered building to use that fuel-fired equipment. Now, let's go on to the next one. Oh, whew, we got to the end. That was a big mouthful for everybody. Thank you to everyone that's still here. I know that was a lot. As we always mention, these slides and the recording will be available on YouTube afterwards. It takes us a couple of days to get it up, but should be there pretty soon if you want to find out more. But for you all that are here, or if you want to go back and review, but for you all here, I presented a lot of information. We're asking for feedback by December 16th. You can use the QR code or the link that should be dropping in the chat. And we've put together a feedback form. And each of those slides that you just saw is actually in the form, so you don't even have to look at there's a little more information in the deck, but you don't even have to look at the deck. You can just go through the form, find the one that you want to talk about if you have feedback, submit it, and we'll be reviewing it. And so we're going to basically now, if you have any questions, let us know. This, I will state, because we've been getting some questions about this too, the feedback form really is not intended for feedback on the regulations requirement itself. This really is to solicit feedback on the application process for these different exemptions. So with that, if you have any any trouble accessing the survey, let us know. You can always email us at beps.mde@maryland.gov. And also our next meeting, we will be going over the feedback received and more information, any other informations in the new year. We've set a Tuesday, January 28th from 2 to 3 p.m. as the next session of this working group. And so you can sign up for that in our form on the website that's kind of letting you sign up for everything. And with that, I'll hand it to Sam so we can get into Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Decarb. Appreciate that and that in-depth overview of all of our government forms. For those of you that are still here, we appreciate it, as Zach said. But there's a lot of content to cover. So we appreciate you all tuning in and hope you can provide feedback on the forms we're releasing. So, and hope you can join in for our next session as well. Just if you haven't contacted us before, email and phone number are up on the screen. Thank you for attending. If you use any one of those contact options, you'll probably get me, but look forward to chatting with you and hearing what questions you got. But regarding questions, we've got about 10 minutes or so left to dive into the questions you've submitted for today's session in the Q&A feature. And so without further ado, I think we can dive into that. And if you joined late or you forgot, you're overwhelmed with forms, and you forgot the original instructions, all good. If you want to submit a question, the Q&A feature is in the activities button, circle, triangle, square. You click there, you get to Q&A. Let us know what you're thinking or what questions you got on your mind. So we're going to dive right in and see what people are wondering and see what we can pitch to Dr. Decarb. Let him get a drink of water after all that talking before I pitch him some questions. But let's see what we got here. Well, I think Dr. Decarb, I think this first one, I think I can answer, and I'll give you a break for another minute. But First question, will these slides be made available following this meeting? Great question. Yes, these slides will be made available. We're recording this session. We're going to upload this recording to the BEPS YouTube playlist, which I believe we dropped a link to in the chat at the beginning. But when you go to that YouTube video, in the description, we're going to post all the materials from the session. So the link to the feedback form will be there, and also the PDF of the slides. So you can get those there once it's live. And I'll send out an email to everyone once it's uploaded, so you don't need to keep click and refresh. But thank you for that question, and we'll keep moving right along. So next question, let's see here. We've got, note that I'm here on behalf of a K through 12 school district, but I do have a question about administration buildings that we own and operate, but we do not have any students in them. Dr. Decarb, I think this one would be a good one for you. Do you think you could highlight, maybe clarify the school exemption and how that applies to administration buildings?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. I tried to point this out earlier. I don't know if you asked this before or after we got to that part, but if your school district, the exemption is for buildings with that are public or non-public elementary and secondary school buildings. So those really are those instructional buildings is the intention here. So if your school district owns a non-school building, an non-instructional building greater than 35,000 square feet, excluding the parking garage area, where that primary use type might be an office. So an administrative building, we might actually call an office if that's just has clerical work going on. Or a warehouse space where you're storing things, that's a warehouse functionally. So then these buildings would need to comply with the BEPS regulation. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Decarb. And thank you to whoever submitted that question. We appreciate it. And diving right back in, let's see what we got next. Okay. So for folks that think their building applies to one of the exemption buckets, I think this one's for you, Zach. Are these buildings automatically exempt, or must they still apply for these exemptions?
Yeah, this is again a good question, and everyone all the buildings that are covered under those big exemptions will need to apply for basically, because we're trying to make sure that each one of these buildings actually qualifies under that exemption. And we've gotten some feedback that there's some nuances to how these buildings are used, and we want to make sure everybody can fairly talk about what's being done in their building to meet that definitions in the regulation. So we're going to do our best, as I mentioned before, to pull out the schools, just because the Department of Education very clearly lists these instructional buildings. But everything else will need to apply, and that these forms that we just laid out are exactly how you do so. And so that's really the plan here and what's being put together. But we have all these pathways so that it's relatively straightforward to submit it for your potentially covered buildings, and then we can review it. The compliance team for the department can review and go forward.
All right. Thank you, Zach. Time check real quick. 3:52. We got about 8 minutes left. So got a question, submit it in the Q&A feature, circle, triangle, square. That's where you need to go. But let's see what else other people are asking. So diving back in. So I think referring to the beginning of the interim standards and the emission standards, Zach, could you just highlight, when we say we need to achieve standards starting in 2030, is it 2030 data reported in 2031, or is it 2029 data reported in 2030?
Yeah, absolutely. Good clarification question. So the 2030 standard is for calendar year 2030, which you would be reporting and and kind of we'll be doing the math as the department in 2031. So from the proposed BEPS regulation specifically, it actually says that you must achieve and maintain the standards. This is one of the sections. Each covered building shall not exceed the net direct emission standards for 2030 through 2034 in each calendar year, including 2030, 2031, 2032, 2033, and 2034, as determined on a yearly basis. It goes on to talk about the second half from 2035 and then 20 through 2040 and beyond. But just focusing in, the whole idea here is you're actually meeting that in the calendar year 2030. So that reporting would be 2030 data reported in 2031. Long answer, but hopefully answers your question.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you for that great question. Okay, let's go back into the Q&A, see what we got loaded up here. Okay, so would a condemned building be exempted as it is not occupied? Or is there consideration for this under that term demolished that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, good question. And some of the details here can vary a little bit building to building, but if it's been condemned, that's going to be a vacant building. So you would put it under as a vacant building and apply for that exemption. And then ultimately that condemned building, when it's demolished, you would apply for demolition to pull it out completely. So that's how that would work. So hopefully that helps clarify that.
Great. Thanks so much. Moving right along. Let's see who we got next. All right, got one for you, Zach, when you're ready. What is the process for a building that is actually smaller than 35,000 square feet, but who is included on the covered buildings list or the preliminary potentially covered buildings list?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is exactly why we have that application for those buildings that are under 35,000 square feet. So that building is going to just submit that application saying, I'm 34,500 square feet. Here's the data that proves it. In that case, you don't even need to put in the unique ID, you need to put in the unique ID because you're already on the list, so that we make sure we take you off. But you put that in, the compliance team here at MDE will review that exemption request. Just like every one of these, each exemption request is going to be thoroughly evaluated by our compliance team, and a determination will be made. Once that determination's made, that will determine if they say yes, you are exempt, that building will be pulled off the list, and that's the end of the story. If that building is determined not exempt, then you've got to comply with the regulation. So that's kind of how that works.
Thank you, Zach. All right, time check, 4 minutes left, so get your questions in. I don't know if we've actually said this during this session today, but if you've joined our previous sessions, you might know. If we don't get to your questions today, we will work to address them in future sessions of this working group. We're going to keep a log of what we've received and hopefully be able to get to them in later sessions. So sorry if we don't get to it today, but we appreciate all of your submissions, and might have a time for one or two more. Got 3 minutes left, so let's just dive back in and see what we're getting. Okay, got a question about what about a historic, Zach, how would they do, or how would they apply for a historic building on a campus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you would be applying for that specific historic building for exemption, and you would use the historic building exemption form. And so that would be your first place to start, is apply for exemption for that historic building. And then campus compliance, if you're if you're asking about campuses, hopefully you've been coming to our campus compliance sessions. We've had a whole bunch of those, or we've had a couple of those. Sorry, I take that back. We've had one, and we have one coming up this Thursday. So a little plug for that one. But basically, campus compliance in many cases, besides some kind of standard ones in portfolio managers requirements, like most more complicated campuses that you think of, like a university, those are going to be fairly individual determinations and kind of work-throughs with the compliance team on how you're including everything. So that would be an example of how that you would apply for exemption for that historic building, and then as you're doing the campus plan and submit a campus compliance application, you would say, well, I've got this one building that's historic and applied for exemption, and that would be worked out in the kind of long-term campus compliance. So very much, those are truly exempted and can be pulled out, and it's just how it all gets worked out over the time. Hope that answers your question. And if you have more questions about campus compliance specifically, I encourage you to register for Thursday's session and come to join that. You can find that sign up form on our website.
Great. All right. Thank you, Dr. Decarb, and thank you to whomever submitted that question. With that, it's 3:59, and I got to close this out. But as always, we appreciate you all attending our 2024 BEPS informational sessions. We really appreciate the interest and all of the questions you've submitted. If we didn't get to your question today, we will work to address them in future sessions of our working groups. So look for that email from us noting when the video is live on YouTube, and materials distributed today will be in the description of that YouTube video again. So check there if you want to recap on anything. But that's 4. So let's call it there. Thank you everyone for attending. And I think for this working group, we'll see you all in 2025. So have a good holiday and a happy new year, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much, everyone.